Brittany, it's a pleasure.
Pleasure to meet you.
Thank you so much for your time today. I know you spent a lot of time and most of your years in the space of mental, emotional health, and now quality and innovation here at the clinic. Today, I would love for you to, share some of your experience and knowledge with us on this subject, because out there in the world, there are so many people who are confused. Mental health, emotional health, people, while depression is real, a lot of people also mindlessly say, oh, I had a bad day, I'm depressed today. Or someone said something to them, oh, I feel depressed because he said that to me. So a lot of people are lost out there. Words like addiction, words like depression. So I would love, to get into your head today and, pull out some of that experience and, knowledge that you have on this subject. So let's start off by you telling me a little bit about yourself and, what got you into this field? What got you into this field from then right up to now?
From quite young, I was able to see the impact of mental health and mental illness and addiction around me and in the world and my communities. And it made me feel quite passionate about being able to really help people, get in touch with people and help them to live the best life possible, which I think is what mental health professionals working really should be aiming to do, helping people to live the best life they can as independently as possible to the best of their abilities. And I was quite lucky that in New Zealand, there's quite a field developing of addictions professionals and co-occurring disorders professionals. So I was able to study at the University of Auckland to really expand my knowledge, to get my degrees, and then start working within the field itself, working in both rehabilitation programs, hospitals, both outpatient and inpatient, really getting quite a diverse level of experience, seeing people from really all walks of life affected by poor mental health, difficult mental illnesses, and of course addiction, which really doesn't discriminate.
That's great. You've seen people from all walks of life. What's the commonality that you see between people who are suffering? Maybe addiction, sometimes maybe their thought process, maybe their behavior. Is there like a commonality that you see, amongst these people?
When it comes to addiction, looking for the common thread, I think people fall into addiction when there's something that's missing in their life. There's something they're looking for, whether that's missing a sense of peace, whether they're looking to escape their troubles or escape their difficulties, or even, unfortunately, people are just looking to have a good time and their habits catch up to them until it's too late to really change and go back. We can think there's a lot of difference between people who come from different countries, different ages, different genders, different cultures, but ultimately there's something that we're looking for, something that we're running from that gets resolved when we engage in an addiction, or at least we have the sensation that it's resolved when we fall into an addiction. When it comes to mental health, I think there's a level of suffering that for those who haven't experienced poor mental health before, they may not be familiar with it, they may not be able to relate to it, but there's this really strong level of suffering that people can experience, whether it's depression, anxiety, psychotic disorders, bipolar, other mood and personality disorders. There's this level of really almost helpless suffering. And if it's the first time people have experienced it and they don't know where to go, who to turn to, it can feel quite all-consuming. And whether you're someone living on the street or living in a chalet, it's really the same across the board once you get behind a closed door.
Wow. So before it's too late, how can people kind of recognize that they're starting to get addicted, or maybe they already are? Or when should they start to reach out? Are there any tips that you can share with us that we can do a self-reflective exercise and kind of assess ourselves? Of course, we can do that professionally as well. But a lot of people don't think they're addicted because they're using it as coping mechanisms to distract themselves, feel good all the time. So could you share some tips that we can kind of reflect on to see and assess ourselves?
I think if you're in a position where you're considering, maybe I have a problem, or I don't quite like the way that my relationship is with this substance anymore, that's already a good indicator that perhaps something is not quite right, if there's that question in your mind. Or if someone you care about or who knows you well has brought that question to you, that's a good place to recognize that maybe I do need to engage in some of that self-reflection. In terms of tools, where do you get started with that? Because it is quite a big question. I would suggest the best place to get started is, what are the pros and cons of my use? What is it that I'm getting out of this? And in what areas is it harming me? For example, people who have quite high social anxiety may use alcohol before an event or during an event to sort of loosen themselves up, to feel like they're being more confident, more outgoing. But if it's getting to the point where, for example, you start to hurt the relationships with people you're with because you get so intoxicated you maybe say or do things that are not in line with who you are, or if you're starting to spend more money than you can really afford to on a particular substance, perhaps you're no longer able to go to work, or you've been going to work hungover or even drunk. Looking at what are the consequences of my use. Of course, everyone thinks there are positives to what they're doing, but really starting to take an inventory of, how is this affecting my whole life, my mental health, my physical health, my social health, even my spiritual health? In what ways is this creating a life that I don't really know if I want to live anymore?
That's helpful. You speak about social anxiety. Can you speak a little bit more about that? Because, you are right. Today we're seeing a lot of people post-pandemic with social anxiety, but we had this before as well. And is it because a lot of people are in the virtual world right now, so when they actually step out? So I would love for you to talk about social anxiety, and you make a beautiful connection of, having to prep up for meeting society. It could be alcohol for some. It could be wanting to fit in, so you need to intoxicate before that. So what are some tips that you have for us to kind of identify social anxiety, and, little tools that we can start to kind of use rather than coping with a substance?
I think you make such a good point that social anxiety post-pandemic has massively increased, particularly I think in younger demographics, people who didn't have that experience of social examples, social circumstances before the pandemic, people who perhaps were just graduating university or just graduating high school into the pandemic. They never had that chance to really socialise outside of a space that was perhaps unsafe or felt unsafe. And particularly in the virtual world, where we can be quite specific and targeted about what we consume, what we watch, what we're exposed to, and then going into the real world where we don't have that level of control, we don't have that level of, okay, I'm just going to log off now, or I'm just going to leave this space now. It can be really quite overwhelming. In terms of tips for how we may be able to cope with social anxiety, one tool that we use often in therapy is both mindfulness and grounding activities, things that sort of take your mind away from up here where all of the thoughts and anxieties are, and really bring you down into the present moment. For example, if someone goes into a supermarket and they find themselves becoming very anxious, very overwhelmed with all of the sights and the sounds and the people, taking a moment to stand still, perhaps do some breathing exercises, really engage with their senses, take a moment to really focus on perhaps the fruit that you've picked up, or what does the trolley look like, what do my feet feel like in my shoes. Really reconnecting with the present moment, because often anxiety is about things that we're fearful might happen in the future that we can't control, or things that have happened in the past that we can't change. And when we take a moment to step out of the past, step out of the future, and bring ourselves to what is actually happening right now. Am I safe right now? Am I in control right now? It can be quite helpful to prevent those spiraling thoughts that can sometimes make anxiety worse or even lead to panic attacks.
So you're in reconnection with ourselves. That's a beautiful way you've put it. So mindfulness and awareness is reconnecting with ourselves, because we're disconnected, or we're connected to the virtual world or our thoughts, and that are getting out of control. I love that. I love the way you've put it. So social anxiety, okay, great. Now, at the clinic, you've been successful with so many people who come to visit. What are some of the cases that you see that are kind of growing up in today's time? Of course, we know there's addiction, there's alcohol, substance, but, back home in our country, we even have gambling, we have pornography, we have shopping, we have mindless sex, relationship after relationship. Is that also addiction?
Of course. We have in addiction what are called substance addictions and behavioural addictions. Substance addictions are maybe what people more classically think of as an addiction when you're using alcohol, cocaine, cannabis, heroin. And it's quite almost normalised to be aware of what these addictions look like. But then there's this new emerging field, and we're seeing it more and more often, of behavioural addictions. People engaging in behaviours that they feel really bring them something, like, for example, love and sex addiction or gambling, even less common addictions like technology addiction or work addiction, even though these are not perhaps diagnosable illnesses within the current set of standards. It's something that's we're becoming increasingly aware of in the field in terms of people really engaging with this behaviour in a way that's problematic, that's causing them harm, and that is really removing, like you said, that connection to ourselves, but also our connections with other people. Often the connection we find with others that's meaningful, authentic, genuine, stable, those are the connections we need to invest in. But when we look at perhaps behavioural addictions like love and sex or technology addiction, we may have the impression we're connecting with people, but really what we're doing is using this behaviour to fill some need that we have that we don't know how to fill any other way.
Wow. Oh, that's powerful. Because, so if you had to explain addiction, okay, what would your definition of addiction be? Because a lot of people start off thinking that, hey, this is just for a short period of time.
Yes.
I'm feeling good. They're coping. So what would your definition of addiction be, basically?
When we talk about addiction, one way we can sort of reduce it down to its core essence is a behaviour that we're engaging in that's causing us harm, and that we find ourselves unable to stop or control despite our intention to do so.
So there's the want to stop it, but we find it difficult.
Yeah, because it's one thing to use a substance and believe that you're fine, believe that things are okay. But often what we see is, and this is what happens for people whose addictions develop quite gradually, they feel like they have control. They feel like things are all neat and tidy and I've got it under my hat. But ultimately with time, what we see is that actually I don't want to use quite this much. Maybe it's costing too much. Or I don't want to drink quite this often. Maybe there are times I need to be more focused. And that inability to either not use as much as you intended to, or to not use at all in some circumstances, or in really intense cases, even needing to use just to function properly. When we have quite severe cases of dependency, there can be this desire to stop that we really can't engage with. We find ourselves unable to control how much or how often we're using.
What are some of the fascinating cases that you've come across in your lifetime, your experience when it comes to addiction, and some of the tips and the tools that you'll have kind of used that you see it's quite powerful in working with these patients? And secondly, if someone's not decided that they want to change yet, like they don't believe they're addicted or they're happy being addicted, there are some people who are not willing to change, or they're just like, I'm happy to live this way. I don't care about my life. It's okay, but I just want to have a good time. Have you had cases like that? And how do you break into these cases?
I think it's so interesting that those two questions come side by side, because when you asked what interesting cases I've seen, I think the most interesting cases to work with are the cases of people who are in denial. Either they're in denial about the severity of their addiction, or they're in denial about the harm that it's causing them and others around them. This is really interesting because it's such a powerful thing to be in denial, to really turn a blind eye to what is actually happening here, the reality of the matter. When it comes to working with individuals who are in denial, one of the interesting tools that we've tended to use therapeutically, but people can even do this by themselves, is creating what we call an addiction timeline. So you take a piece of paper and you draw across it a timeline, and you input periods of your use. For example, when was I using the heaviest? Did I have any relapses or any periods where I was sober? Were there any times where I felt like my use got really out of control, or times where perhaps I was using way less than I have in the past? Then you start looking at what are the big events in my life that have happened, breakups, weddings, promotions, being fired, and you start building that. Then you start to look at What are the relationships in my life like? Okay, during this time, my relationship with my partner was really good. During this time, my relationship with my mother was really difficult. And as you build in more and more details into this timeline, you start to see the connections that perhaps we might not otherwise make. We often have a tendency to categorize or cordon off areas of our brain. Oh, my drinking has absolutely nothing to do with my work, or my relationship with my partner has absolutely nothing to do with my smoking on the weekends with my friends. But when we start to put all the pieces of the puzzle together on one sheet of paper, we start to realize, actually, I had a really big relapse and then things with my mother went south, or I had this huge wedding of perhaps my daughter or a really close friend, and I noticed the whole time before this I started drinking really heavily. Of course, it's easier to make these connections when you're with a professional who can make those observations, but even doing it by yourself, if you're in that space where you want to be really reflective, or perhaps you're doing it with a loved one who is in denial, and you can show them, look, do you see these patterns? Do you see these connections? It can also be quite powerful in terms of breaking that denial that may be there.
Thanks for that exercise. That's super easy for us to at least start off with.
Yeah.
And then if we find ourselves lost, of course, we take professional help. Do you think people are in denial because they don't want to feel shamed? They don't want to feel ashamed of themselves? If, you know, like if I had someone tell me and show me my blind spots, there would be a whole amount of shame, I guess, because the ego comes up to pride. It wants to protect us. Do you think shame is one of the outcomes why people are, or they just choose, they know they're doing something wrong, but they don't want, they want to feel right in their mind?
I think shame is such a huge emotion that's associated with addiction. Shame and guilt are quite often two sides of the same coin. We feel ashamed about a part of who we are or how we've behaved. We feel guilty perhaps about how that behaviour or that aspect of ourselves has influenced other people. Often we see shame come up quite strongly in people who are in denial in terms of not wanting to admit or accept, okay, this is part of who I am. Often people who just completely ignore the issue can say, oh, I'm in denial, I'm in denial. Maybe there's a part of them that really does know how bad things are, or a part of them who really does accept they need to change. But at the end of the day, as long as that shame is so strong and so powerful, it can be really hard to get them to admit to themselves, let alone to others, what they're doing needs to change. The other aspect of denial may be perhaps this person doesn't know that what they're doing is wrong or excessive. There are some cultures and countries where drinking is really celebrated and it's just a normal part of everyday life. If you were to turn down a drink, people might say, what's wrong with you? You know, you're the problem if you don't want to engage in these behaviours. And that can bring in an aspect of normalcy to excessive consumption, especially if we get into friend groups who party or use drugs, for example. If we develop relationships that normalise harmful behaviours, it can be difficult to know, okay, actually, this isn't normal. This isn't how most people live. And aside from that, this isn't how really I want to live anymore. And it can be difficult when you're working with a patient to really know what side are they coming from. Are they in denial because they're ashamed, or are they in denial because perhaps they don't know better?
I want to go back to what you said, which was very powerful. It involves the word perception, normalizing. Like a lot of teenagers think that college life is about drugs and fun.
Yes.
That's like maybe a small part of it, but it's kind of normalized now. But if we can normalize new, patterns that, hey, college life is about meeting new friends, making new connections, having new hobbies. I think it's kind of perception, because we try to conform to perceptions, and especially teenagers, it's all about conformity, conforming to the latest trend. And the same thing with adults today, because we have a lot of young adults who, want to experience different things in their 30s, during their marriages. So you're right, it's becoming normalized, and that's why people are kind of thinking that, hey, this is the path to go, and if I don't do it, I may be the odd one out. Yeah,
I mean, I think even before the popularity of social media, there was this aspect of when you're a young adult and you're sort of leaving the nest, you need a new group with which you can identify, a new group of friends, or I'm a university student and this is what it looks like to be a university student, or I'm a rugby player, and this is what it looks like to be a rugby player. And we look for these groups and communities with which we can identify and belong to. And when these communities and groups have behaviours that aren't health promoting, that aren't enhancing of our own well-being, it can be really tricky to break out of those groups and find a new way of being, while still perhaps, maybe I do want to play rugby, but I don't want to go out for a beer after the game. I think with social media, what we've seen also is the rise in trends and aesthetics, and what does it mean to behave a certain way, to look a certain way. And with our lives now being so public, whether we're choosing to or not, there's so much visibility on us. There's even more pressure almost to conform to a certain way of being, a style, a trend, and to be on the bandwagon, as it were, so that we're not isolated, so that we're not left out. Even though it's a very normal human response, I think what we now need to do is find ways of utilising this response to be health promoting. There's a huge rise in young people being sober, choosing not to drink, choosing not to be a drug user. It's becoming more and more popular because people, I think, are starting to see actually who I want to be and the way I want to live my life. I don't have to conform to this preconceived notion of what I imagined that looking like.
Little elements like this that you'll have got together. I had time with a dietitian who did such a holistic analysis. I was so happy when she spoke about the gut connection with the brain and how we can't heal over here unless we start to heal over here. And then you'll have sound therapy, you have exercise, which is usually just go for a walk or hit the gym, that's it. But over here, there's the connection of mind, body, breath with movement. You'll have put this model together so beautifully. I know you had quality and innovation. What's next? What do you think you're going to fit into the puzzle next along the way?
What I really appreciate about this clinic is we're always looking for how can we improve, what can we do better. And the exciting thing is that as mental health and addictions has really come to the forefront of the general public's mind, there's much more attention being paid on the research side of things in terms of what can we be doing differently. For a long time, behavioural therapy, specifically cognitive behavioural therapy, was the answer to a lot of issues. And of course, I'm a big advocate of those therapies, but I think we can no longer ignore the reality that we have our mind, of course, which is intangible, but we also have our physical body. And there's also something else that really gives us life and gives us drive and makes us alive. And it's this something else that has been so neglected in the past when it comes to supporting people in recovery, whether that's recovery from addiction or recovery from mental illness, or just trying to get your mental health right, even if you don't have a sort of diagnosis. I think for us, we're looking to explore ways for how we can really enhance, support, and create that connection for people between these three elements, whilst doing it in a way that's evidence-based, that supports well-being, and that is in line with people's goals and needs for themselves.
I think that's amazing because for the longest time, even in the medical world, it's always been fragmented. You have a kidney problem, treat the kidney.
Yes.
In our field of integrative and lifestyle medicine, we've been trying to put it together. Yeah, you have a kidney problem, great, take your medicine. But let's find out what's hurting your kidney. What are some of the lifestyle changes that you can make so that you kind of address the root cause of the problem? And I see that you're doing this in the mental health space, putting it all together, whatever's broken, putting it all together. And I love that. But before I end, what do you do for your mental and emotional health?
For myself, I think one of the biggest things is really spending a lot of time in nature.
I'm envious of you.
Yeah.
You have it all around you.
I'm quite lucky, being here, I'm quite lucky that I have the lake, I have the mountains, I have the forests, I have the meadows. And I think really spending time being in a natural space, it really brings us something that I think we're missing more and more in modern worlds as big cities continue getting bigger and we continue to sort of live our life in quite a contained way. I think getting into nature, getting into spaces where you can breathe the fresh air, you can feel the sun on your face or the rain on your skin. I think there's something special that I almost can't put into words that really supports you in terms of just feeling so much better after a rough day.
I kind of relate to that. In India, we have We have Tata Memorial Hospital that treats, it's one of the best cancer hospitals in the country. And also the work they do, they treat the less privileged, children and adults who have cancer. They treat them free of charge, but they come in from the most remote parts of the country. So from villages, when they come into the city, their mental health is very different. When they go back to their villages, again, with nature, they're completely different because we speak to these patients over Zoom when they're back in their villages. And the impact of nature on them and when they're in the city for treatment is a vast difference. It makes us think that all treatments have to be in the lap of nature because I believe it has a profound healing impact. But thank you for sharing that, and thank you for all the amazing work I've had a chance to experience while I'm here. I love the holistic approach, and I think that's why there will always be success with everyone who comes here, and I hope for that. Thank you so much, Brittany.
Fantastic. Thank you. Cheers.